Barbarossa, King of the Corsairs, From Seawolves of the Mediterranean, by E. Hamilton Curry, R.N. At the coming of spring, Barbarossa was at sea again with 32 ships, ready for any eventuality, his crews aflame with ardour for revenge against those by whom they had been so roughly handled. He chose for the scene of operations a place on the coast of Majorca some 15 miles from Palma. From here he commanded the route of the Spaniards from their country to the African coast, and it was against this nation that he felt a great bitterness owing to recent events. Eagerly did the Corsair and his men watch for the Spanish ships, the heavier vessels lying at anchor, but the light, swift galleys ranging and questing afar so that none might be missed. Very soon the vigilance of the Moslems was rewarded by the capture of a number of vessels sent by Bernard de Mendoza, laden with Turkish and Moorish slaves, destined to be utilized as rowers in the Spanish galleys. These men were hailed as a welcome reinforcement, and joyfully joined the forces of Hayreddin when he moved on Minorca, captured the castle by a surprise assault, raided the surrounding country, and captured 5,700 Christians, amongst whom were 800 men who had been wounded in the attack on Tunis. All these unfortunates were sent to refill the bagnio of Algiers. This private war of revenge was, however, destined soon to come to an end. Suleiman the Magnificent in this year became involved in disputes with the Venetian Republic, and recalled that veritable man of the sea, as Barbarossa had been described by Ibrahim, to Constantinople. In this city by the sea there had taken place a tragedy, which, although it only involved the death of a single man, was nevertheless far-reaching in its consequences. For the man was none other than that great statesman Ibrahim, Grand Vizier, and the only trusted counsellor of the Padishah. He who had been originally a slave had risen step by step in the favour of his master until he arrived at the giddy eminence which he occupied at the time of his death. It is a somewhat curious commentary on the essentially democratic status of an autocracy that a man could thus rise to a position second only to that of the autocrat himself, and in all probability wielding quite as much power. Ibrahim had for years been treated by Suleiman more as a brother than as a dependent, which in spite of his Grand Viziership he was in fact. They lived in the very closest communion, taking their meals together and even sleeping in the same room. Suleiman, a man of high intelligence himself, and a ruler who kept in touch with all the happenings which arose in his immense dominions, desiring always to have at hand the man whom he loved, from whom, with his amazing grip of political problems and endless fertility of resource, he was certain of sympathy and sound advice. But in an Oriental despotism there are other forces at work besides those of la haute politique, and Ibrahim had one deadly enemy who was sworn to compass his destruction. The Sultana Roxolana was the light of the harem of the Grand Turk. This supremely beautiful woman, originally a Russian slave, was the object of the most passionate devotion on the part of Suleiman. But she was as ambitious as she was lovely, and brooked no rival in the affections of Suleiman, be that person man, woman, or child. In her hands the master of millions, the despot whose nod was death, became a submissive slave. The undisciplined passions of this headstrong woman swept aside from her path all those whom she suspected of sharing her influence, in no matter how remote a fashion. At her dictation had Suleiman caused to be murdered his son Mustafa, a youth of the brightest promise, because in his intelligence and his winning ways he threatened to eclipse Selim, the son of Roxolana herself. This woman possessed a strong natural intelligence, albeit she was totally uneducated. She saw and knew that Ibrahim was all-powerful with her lover, and this roused her jealousy to fever heat. She was not possessed of a cool judgment, which would have told her that Ibrahim was a statesman dealing with the external affairs of the Sublime Porte, and that with her and with her affairs he neither desired nor had he the power to interfere. What, however, the Sultana did know was that in these same affairs of state her opinion was dust in the balance when weighed against that of the Grand Vizier. Suleiman had that true attribute of supreme greatness, the unerring aptitude for the choice of the right man. He had picked out Ibrahim from among his immense entourage, and never once had he regretted his choice. As time went on and the intellect and power of the man became more and more revealed to his master, that sovereign left in his hands even such matters as despots are apt to guard most jealously. We have seen how, in spite of the murmurings of the whole of his capital and the almost insubordinate attitude of his navy, he had persevered in the appointment of Hayreddin Barbarossa, because the judgment of Ibrahim was in favour of its being carried out. This to Roxalana was gall and wormwood. Well she knew that, as long as the Grand Vizier lived, her sovereignty was at best but a divided one. There was a point at which her blandishment stopped short. This was when she found that her opinion did not coincide with that of the minister. She was, as we have seen in instance of her son, not a woman to stick at trifles, and she decided that Ibrahim must die. There could be no hole and corner business about this. He must die, and when his murder had been accomplished, she would boldly avow to her lover what she had done and take the consequences, believing in her power over him to come scatheless out of the adventure. In those days, when human life was so cheap, she might have asked for the death of almost anyone, and her whim would have been gratified by a lover who had not hesitated to put to death his own son at her dictation. But with Ibrahim it was another matter. He was the familiar of the Sultan, his alter ego in fact. It says much for the nerve of the Sultana that she dared so greatly on this memorable and lamentable occasion. On March the 5th, 1536, Ibrahim went to the royal seraglio and, following his ancient custom, was admitted to the table of his master, sleeping after the meal at his side. At least so it was supposed, but none knew, save those engaged in the murder, what passed on that fateful night. The next day his dead body lay in the house of the Sultan. Across the floor of jasper, in that palace which was a fitting residence for one rightly known as the Magnificent, the blood of Ibrahim flowed to the feet of Roxalana. The disordered clothing, the terrible expression of the face of the dead man, the gaping wounds which he had received, bore witness that there had taken place a grim struggle before that iron frame and splendid intellect had been levelled with the dust. This much leaked out afterwards, as such things will leak out, and then the Sultana took Suleiman into her chamber and gazed up into his eyes. The man was stunned by the immensity of the calamity which had befallen him and his kingdom, but his manhood availed him not against the wiles of this Circe. Ibrahim had been foully done to death in his own palace, and this woman clinging so lovingly round his neck now was the murderess. The heart's blood of his best friend was coagulating on the threshold of his own apartment when he forgave her by whom his murder had been accomplished. This was the vengeance of Roxalana, and who shall say that it was not complete? The Ottoman Empire was the poorer by the loss of its greatest man. The jealousy of the Sultana was assuaged. The despot who had permitted this unavenged murder was still on the throne, thrall to the woman who had first murdered his son and then his friend and minister. But the deed carried with it the evil consequences which were only too likely to occur when so capable a head of the state was removed at so critical a time. Renewed strife was in the air, and endless squabbles between Venice and the Porte were taking place. With these we have no concern, but in addition to other complaints, there were loud and continuous ones concerning the Corsairs. Venice, the bride of the sea, had neither rest nor peace. The pirates swarmed in Corfu, in Zante, in Candia, in Cephalonia, and the plunder and murder of the subjects of the Republic was the theme of the perpetual representations to the Sultan. The balance of advantage in this guerrilla warfare was with the Corsairs until Girolamo Canale, a Venetian captain, seized one of the Moslem leaders known as the Young Moor of Alexandria. The victory of Canale was somewhat an important one, as he captured the galley of the Young Moor and 4 others. 2 more were sunk, and 300 Janissaries and 1,000 slaves fell into the hands of the Venetian commander. There being an absence of nice feeling on the part of the Venetians, the Janissaries were at once beheaded to a man. The whole story is an illustration of the extraordinary relations existing among the Mediterranean states at this time. Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of Turkey, had lent 300 of his Janissaries, his own picked troops, to assist the Corsairs in their depredations on Venetian commerce. Having done this, and the Janissaries having been caught and summarily and rightly put to death as pirates, the Sultan, as soon as he heard of what had occurred, sent an ambassador, one Yonis Bey, to Venice to demand satisfaction for the insult passed upon him by the beheading of his own soldiers turned pirates. The conclusion of the affair was that the Venetians released the young Moor of Alexandria as soon as he was cured of the 8 wounds which he had received in the conflict, and sent him back to Africa with such of his galleys as were left. There was one rather comical incident in connection with this affair, which was that when Yonis Bey was on his way from Constantinople to Venice, he was chased by a Venetian fleet under the command of the Count Grandenico and driven ashore. The Count was profuse in his apologies when he discovered that he had been chasing a live ambassador, but the occurrence so exasperated Suleiman that he increased his demands in consequence. Barbarossa, who had spent his time harrying the Spaniards at sea ever since the fall of Tunis, was shortly to appear on the scene again. He received orders from the Sultan and came as fast as a favouring wind would bring him. Hayreddin had been doing well in the matter of slaves and plunder, but he knew that, with the backing of the Grand Turk, he would once again be in command of a fleet in which he might repeat his triumph of past years, and prove himself once more the indispensable man of the sea. Soon after his arrival his ambitions were gratified, and he found himself with a fleet of 100 ships. Since the death of Ibrahim and the incident which terminated with the dispatch of Yonis Bey to Venice, the relations between the Grand Turk and the Venetian Republic had become steadily worse, and at last the Sultan declared war. On May the 7th, 1537, Suleiman, accompanied by his 2 sons, Selim and Mohammed, left Constantinople. With the campaign conducted by the Sultan, we are not concerned here. It was directed against the Ionian Islands, which had been in the possession of Venice since 1401. On August the 18th, Suleiman laid siege to Corfu and was disastrously beaten, re-embarking his men on September the 7th, after losing thousands in a fruitless attack on the fortress. He returned to Constantinople utterly discomfited. It was the 7th campaign which the Sultan had conducted in person, but the first in which the ever-faithful Ibrahim had not been by his side. This defeat at the hands of the Venetians was not, however, the only humiliation which he was destined to experience in this disastrous year. For once again Doria, that scourge of the Moslem, was loose upon the seas, and was making his presence felt in the immediate neighbourhood of Corfu, where the Turks had been defeated. On July the 17th, Andrea had left the port of Messina with 25 galleys, had captured 10 richly laden Turkish ships, gutted and burned them. Hayreddin was at sea at the time, but the great rivals were not destined to meet on this occasion. Instead of Barbarossa, Andrea fell in with Ali Cebeli, the lieutenant of Sanjak Bey of Gallipoli. On July the 22nd, the Genoese admiral and the Turkish commander from the Dardanelles met to the southward of Corfu, off the small island of Paxo, and a smart action ensued. It ended in the defeat of Ali Cebeli, whose galleys were captured and towed by Doria into Paxo. That veteran fighter was himself in the thickest of the fray, and conspicuous in his crimson doublet, had been an object of attention to the marksmen of Cebeli during the entire action. In spite of the receipt of a severe wound in the knee, the admiral refused to go below until victory was assured. He was surrounded at this time by a devoted band of nobles, sworn to defend the person of their admiral or to die in his defence. His portrait has been sketched for us at this time by the Dominican friar Padre Alberto Guglielmotto, author of La Guerra dei Pirati e la Marina Pontifica dal 1500 al 1560. The description runs thus. Andrea Doria was of lofty stature, his face oval in shape, forehead broad and commanding. His neck was powerful, his hair short, his beard long and fan-shaped. His lips were thin, his eyes bright and piercing. Once again had he defeated an officer of the Grand Turk, and it may be remarked that Ibrahim was probably quite right in the estimation, or rather in the lack of estimation, in which he held the sea officers of his master. as they seemed to have been deficient in every quality save that of personal valour, and in their encounters with Doria and the knights were almost invariably worsted. For the sake of Islam, for the prestige of the Moslem arms at sea, it was time that Barbarossa should take matters in hand once more. The autumn of this year, 1537, proved that the old sea-wolf had lost none of his cunning, that his followers were as terrible as ever. What did it seem to matter that Venetian and Catalan, Genoese and Frenchman, Andalusian and the dwellers in the archipelago were all banded together in league against this common foe? Did not the redoubtable Andrea range the seas in vain, and were not all the efforts of the Knights of St. John futile, when the son of the renegado from Mitylena and his Christian wife put forth from the Golden Horn? What was the magic of this man, it was asked despairingly, that none seemed able to prevail against him? Had it not been currently reported that Carlos V, the great emperor, had driven him forth from Tunis a hunted fugitive, broken and penniless, with never a galley left, without one ducat in his pocket? Was he so different, then, from all the rest of mankind, that his followers would stick to him in evil report, as well as in the height of his prosperity? Men swore and women crossed themselves at the mention of his name. Terrible as an army with banners indeed was Hayreddin in this eventful summer. Things had gone badly with the crescent flag. The Padishah was unapproachable in his palace, brooding perchance on that might have been, had he not sold his honour and the life of his only friend to gratify the malice of a she-devil. Those in attendance on the Sultan trembled, for the humour of the despot was black indeed. But the veritable man of the sea was in some sort to console him for that which he had lost, as never in his own history, and there was none else with which it could be compared, had the Corsair king made so fruitful a raid. He ravaged the coasts of the Adriatic and the islands of the archipelago, sweeping in slaves by the thousand, and by the end of the year he had collected 18,000 in the arsenal at Stamboul. Great was the jubilation in Constantinople when the Admiralissimo himself returned from his last expedition against the infidel. Stilled were the voices which hinted disaffection. Who among them all could bring back 400,000 pieces of gold? What mariner could offer to the Grand Turk such varied and magnificent presents? Upon his arrival, Barbarossa asked permission to kiss the threshold of the palace of the Sultan, which boon being graciously accorded to him, he made his triumphal entry. 200 captives clad in scarlet robes carried cups of gold and flasks of silver. Behind them came 30 others, each staggering under an enormous purse of sequins. Yet another 200 brought collars of precious stones, or bales of the choicest goods, and a further 200 were laden with sacks of small coin. Certainly, if Suleiman the Magnificent had lost a Grand Vizier, he had succeeded in finding an admiral. All through the earlier months of 1538, the dockyards of Constantinople hummed with a furious activity, for Suleiman had decreed that the maritime campaign of this year was to begin with no less than 150 ships. His admiral, however, did not agree with this decision. To the viziers he raged and stormed. "Listen," he said, "O men of the land who understand naught of the happenings of the sea. By this time Saleh Reish must have quitted Alexandria, convoying to the Bosphorus 20 sail filled with the richest merchandise. Should he fall in with the accursed Genoese Doria, where then will be Saleh Reish and his galleys and his convoy? I will tell you, the ships in Genoa, the galleys burned, Saleh Reish and all his mariners chained to the rowers' bench." The viziers trembled as men did when Barbarossa stormed and turned upon them those terrible eyes which knew neither fear nor pity. "We be but men," they answered, "and our lord the Sultan has so ordained it." "I have 40 galleys," replied the Corsair. "You have 40 more. With these I will take the sea. But mark you," he continued, softening somewhat, "you do right to fear the displeasure of the Sultan, and I also have no wish to encounter it. But vessels raised and equipped in a hurry will be of small use to me. In the name of Allah the Compassionate and his holy Prophet, give me my 80 galleys and let me go." In Hayreddin Barbarossa, sound strategical instinct went hand in hand with the desperate valour of the Corsair. To dally in the Golden Horn, while so rich a prey was at sea to be picked up by his Christian foes, was altogether opposed to his instincts. Never to throw away a chance in the game of life had ever been his guiding principle. Suleiman, great man as he undoubtedly was, had not the adamantine hardness of character which enabled his admiral to risk all on the hazards of the moment. Or possibly the Grand Turk was deficient in that clearness of strategical instinct which never, in any circumstances, forgoes a present advantage for something which may turn out well in a problematical future. Suleiman, sore, sullen, and unapproachable, dwelt in his palace brooding over the misfortunes which had been his lot since the death of Ibrahim. Barbarossa, who so recently had lost practically all that he possessed, and who had reached an age at which most men have no hopes for the future, was as clear in intellect, as undaunted in spirit as if he had been half a century younger. To be even once more with those by whom he had been defeated and dispossessed was the only thing now in his mind. The capture of Saleh Reis and his convoy would be a triumph of which he could not bear to think. Further, it would add to the demoralization of the sea forces of the Sultan, which were sadly in need of some striking success after the defeats which had so recently been their portion. The Sultan had decided that 150 ships were necessary. His admiral thought otherwise. There was too much at stake for him to dally at Constantinople. His fiery energy swept all before it, and in the end he had his way. On June the 7th, 1538, he finally triumphed over the hesitations of the viziers, and put to sea with 80 sail. The Sultan, from his kiosk, the windows of which opened on the Bosphorus, counted the ships. "Only 80 sail? Is that all?" he asked. The trembling viziers prostrated themselves before him. "Oh, our lord, the Padishah!" they cried. "Saleh Reis comes from Alexandria with a rich convoy. Somewhere lurking is Andrea Doria, the accursed. It was necessary, O magnificent, to send succor." There was a pause, in which the hearts of men beat as do those who know not but that the next moment may be their last on earth. The Sultan stared from his window at the retreating ships, in a silence like the silence of the grave. At last he turned. "So be it," he answered briefly, "but see to it that reinforcements do not lag upon the road." If there had been activity in the dockyards before, it was as nothing to the strenuous work that was to be done henceforward. Before starting on this expedition, Hayreddin had made an innovation in the manning of some of the most powerful of his galleys, which was of the utmost importance, and which was to add enormously to the success of his future maritime enterprises. The custom had always been that the Ottoman galleys had been rowed by Christians, captured and enslaved. Of course the converse was true in the galleys of their foes. There were, for the size of the vessels, an enormous number of men carried in the galleys of the 16th century, and an average craft of this description would have on board some 400 men. Of these, however, the proportion would be 250 slaves to 150 fighting men. That which Hayreddin now insisted upon was that a certain proportion of his most powerful units should be rowed by Moslem fighting men, so that on the day of battle the oarsmen could join in the fray instead of remaining chained to their benches, as was the custom with the slaves. It is, however, an extraordinary testimony to the influence which the Corsair had attained in Constantinople that he had been able to effect this change in the composition of some of his crews. It must have been done with the active cooperation of the Sultan, as no authority less potent than that of the sovereign himself could have induced free men to undertake the terrible toil of rower in a galley. This was reserved for the unfortunate slave on either side, owing to the intolerable hardship of the life, and results in the pace at which a galley proceeded through the water were usually obtained by an unsparing use of the lash on the naked bodies of the rowers. This human material was used up in the most prodigal manner possible, as those in command had not the inducement of treating the rowers well, from that economic standpoint which causes a man to so use his beast of burden as to get the best work from him. In the galley, when a slave would row no more, he was flung overboard, and another was put in his place. The admiral, however, even when backed by the Padishah, could not man a large fleet of galleys with Moslem rowers, and as there was a shortage in the matter of propelling power, his first business was to collect slaves. and for this purpose he visited the islands of the archipelago. The lot of the unhappy inhabitants of these was indeed a hard one. They were nearer to the seat of the Moslem power than any other Christians. They were in those days totally unable to resist an attack in force, and in consequence were swept off in their thousands. 7 islands cover the entrance to the Gulf of Volo. The nearest to the coast is Skiathos, which is also the most important. It was defended by a castle built upon a rock. This castle was attacked by Barbarossa, who bombarded it for 6 days, carried it by assault, and massacred the garrison. He spared the lives of the inhabitants of the island, and by this means secured 3,400 rowers for his galleys. He had to provide motor power for the reinforcements which he expected. In July he was reinforced from Constantinople by 90 galleys, while from Egypt came Saleh Reis, who had succeeded in avoiding the terrible Doria with 20 more. The fleet was thus complete. End of section 6. Recording by Marion Martin.
Great Pirate Stories by Various, edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 1, The Picaroon. The Picaroon, footnote, from Tom Kringle's Log, by Michael Scott. Quote, "Ours the wild life in tumult, still to range." Unquote. The Corsair. We returned to Cartagena to be at hand should any opportunity occur for Jamaica, and were lounging about one forenoon on the fortifications, looking with sickening hearts out to seaward, when a voice struck up the following Negro ditty close to us. Father was a Coromantee, mother was a Mingo, black pickaninny Bukrawanti, so dem Selamy, Peter by Jingo, jiggery jiggery jiggery. "Well sung, Massa Bungo," exclaimed Mr. Splinter. "Where do you hail from, my hearty?" "Hello, Bungo, indeed, free and easy that, anyhow. Who you yourself, eh?" "Why, Peter," continued the lieutenant, "don't you know me?" "Cannot say that I do," rejoined the Negro very gravely, without lifting his head, as he sat mending his jacket in one of the embrasures near the water gate of the arsenal. "Have not the honor of your acquaintance, sir." He then resumed his scream, for song it could not be called. "Mammy Sally's daughter lose him shoe in an old canoe that lay half full of water, and then she knew not what to do. Jiggery jig, confound your jiggery jiggery, sir. But I know you well enough, my man, and you can scarcely have forgotten Lieutenant Splinter of the Torch, one would think." However, it was clear that the poor fellow really had not known us, for the name so startled him that, in his hurry to unlace his legs from under him as he sat tailor fashion, he fairly capsized out of his perch and toppled down on his nose, a feature, fortunately, so flattened by the hand of nature that I question if it could have been rendered more obtuse had he fallen out of the maintop on a timber head, or a marine officer's. No, yes, him sure enough." "And who is the pickaninny officer?" "Oh, I see, Massa Tom Kringle, garamighty gentleman, where have you dropped from?" "Where is the old Torch? Many a time have I, Peter Mangrove, pilot to him Britannic Majesty's squadron, taken the old brig in and through amongst the keys at Port Royal." "Aye, and how often did you scour her copper against the coral reefs, Peter?" His Majesty's pilot gave a knowing look, and laid his hand on his breast. "No more of that, if you love me, massa." Well, it don't signify anyhow, my boy. She will never give you that trouble again. Foundered, all hands lost, Peter, but the 2 you see before you. Wery sorry, Massa Splinter, wery sorry. What, the black cook's mate and all? But misfortune can't be helped. Stop till I put up my needle, and I will take a turn with you." Here he drew himself up with a great deal of absurd gravity. "Proper that British officer in distress should assist one another. We shall consult together. How can I serve you?" Why, Peter, if you could help us to a passage to Port Royal, it would be serving us most essentially. When we used to be lying there, a week seldom passed without one of the squadron arriving from this, but here we have been for more than a month without a single pennant belonging to the station having looked in. Our money is running short, and if we are to hold on in Cartagena for another 6 weeks, we shall not have a shot left in the locker, not a copper to tinkle on a tombstone. The negro looked steadfastly at us, then carefully around. There was no one near. You see, Massa Splinter, I am desirable to serve you for one little reason of my own, but beside that, it is good for me at present to make some friend with the officer of the squadron, being as how that I am absent without leave. Oh, I perceive a large R against your name in the master attendant's books, eh? You have hit it, sir, very close. Besides, I long much to return to my poor wife Nancy Cater, that I leave, vagabond that I is, just about to be confined. I could not resist putting in my oar. I saw Nancy just before we sailed, Peter. Fine child, that. Not quite so black as you, though. Oh, massa, said Snowball, grinning and showing his white teeth. You know I am such a terrible black fellow, and when you are a little out at present, massa, I mean about to be confined in the workhouse for stealing the Admiral's Muscovy ducks, and he laughed loud and long. However, if you will promise that you will stand my friends, I will put you in the way of getting a shove across to the east end of Jamaica, and I will go with you too for company. Thank you, rejoined Mr. Splinter, but how do you mean to manage this? There is no Kingston trader here at present, and you don't mean to make a start of it in an open boat, do you? No, sir, I don't, but in the first place, as you are a gentleman, will you try and get me off when we get to Jamaica? Secondly, will you promise that you will not seek to know more of the vessel you may go in, nor of her crew, than they are willing to tell you, provided you are landed safe? Why, Peter, I scarcely think you would deceive us, for you know I saved your bacon in that awkward affair, when, through drunkenness, you plumped the torch ashore, so forget that, sir, forget that. Never shall poor black pilot forget how you saved him from being seized up when the gratings, boatswain's mates, and all were ready at the gangway. Never shall poor black rascal forget that. Indeed, I do not think you would wittingly betray us into trouble, Peter, and as I guess you mean one of the forced traders, we will venture in her rather than kick about here any longer, and pay a moderate sum for our passage. Then wait here 5 minutes. And so saying, he slipped down through the embrasure into a canoe that lay beneath, and in a trice we saw him jump on board of a long, low, nondescript kind of craft that lay moored within pistol-shot of the walls. She was a large, shallow vessel, coppered to the bends, of great breadth of beam, with bright sides like an American, so painted as to give her a clumsy mercantile sheen externally. But there were many things that belied this to a nautical eye. Her copper, for instance, was bright as burnished gold on her very sharp bows and beautiful run, and we could see from the bastion where we stood that her decks were flush and level. She had no cannon mounted that were visible, but we distinguished grooves on her well-scrubbed decks, as from the recent traversing of carronade slides, while the bolts and rings in her high and solid bulwarks shone clear and bright in the ardent noontide. There was a tarpaulin stretched over a quantity of rubbish, old sails, old junk, and hen coops, rather ostentatiously piled up forward, which we conjectured might conceal a long gun. She was a very taut-rigged hermaphrodite, or brig forward and schooner aft. Her foremast and bowsprit were immensely strong and heavy, and her mainmast was so long and tapering that the wonder was how the few shrouds and stays about it could support it. It was the handsomest stick we had ever seen. Her upper spars were on the same scale, tapering away through topmast, topgallant mast, royal and skysail masts, until they were fined away into slender wands. The sails, that were loose to dry, were old and patched, and evidently displayed to cloak the character of the vessel by an ostentatious show of their unserviceable condition. But her rigging was beautifully fitted, every rope lying in the chafe of another being carefully served with hide. There were several large bushy-whiskered fellows lounging about the deck, with their hair gathered into dirty net bags, like the fishermen of Barcelona. Many had red silk sashes around their waists, through which were stuck their long knives in sharkskin sheaths. Their numbers were not so great as to excite suspicion, but a certain daring, reckless manner would at once have distinguished them, independently of anything else, from the quiet, hard-worked, red-shirted merchant seamen. "That chap is not much to be trusted," said the lieutenant. "His bunting would make a few jackets for Joseph, I take it." But we had little time to be critical before our friend Peter came paddling back with another blackamoor in the stern, of as ungainly an exterior as could well be imagined. He was a very large man, whose weight every now and then, as they breasted the short sea, cocked up the snout of the canoe with Peter Mangrove in it, as if he had been a cork, leaving him to flourish his paddle in the air, like the weather wheel of a steamboat in a seaway. The newcomer was strong and broad-shouldered, with long, muscular arms and a chest like Hercules, but his legs and thighs were, for his bulk, remarkably puny and misshapen. A thick fell of black wool, in close tufts, as if his face had been stuck full of cloves, covered his chin and upper lip, and his hair, if hair it could be called, was twisted into 100 short plaits that bristled out and gave his head, when he took his hat off, the appearance of a porcupine. There was a large sabre cut across his nose and down his cheek, and he wore 2 immense gold earrings. His dress consisted of short cotton drawers that did not reach within 2 inches of his knee, leaving his thin cucumber shanks, on which the small bullet-like calf appeared to have been stuck before, through mistake, in place of a baft, naked to the shoe, a check shirt, and an enormously large Panama hat, made of a sort of cane, split small and worn shovel fashion. Notwithstanding, he made his bow by no means ungracefully, and offered his services in choice Spanish, but spoke English as soon as he heard who we were. "Pray, sir, are you the master of that vessel?" said the lieutenant. "No, sir, I am the mate, and I learn you are desirous of a passage to Jamaica." This was spoken in a broad Scotch accent. "Yes, we are," said I, in very great astonishment, "but we will not sail with the devil, and whoever saw a Negro Scotchman before, the spirit of Nickel Jarvey conjured into a blackamoor's skin?" The fellow laughed. "I am black, as you see. So were my father and mother before me." And he looked at me, as much as to say, "I have read the book you quote from, but I was born in the good town of Port Glasgow notwithstanding, and many a voyage I have made as the cabin boy and cook in the good ship the Peggy Bogle, with worthy old Jock Hunter. But that matters not. I was told you wanted to go to Jamaica. I dare say our captain will take you for a moderate passage money. But here he comes to speak for himself, Captain Van der Bosch. Here are 2 shipwrecked British officers who wish to be put on shore on the east end of Jamaica. Will you take them, and what will you charge for their passage?" The man he spoke to was nearly as tall as himself. He was a sunburnt, angular, raw-boned, iron-visaged veteran, with a nose in shape and color like the bowl of his own pipe, but not at all, according to the received idea, like a Dutchman. His dress was quizzical enough: white trousers, a long flapped embroidered waistcoat that might have belonged to a Spanish grandee, with an old-fashioned French-cut coat, showing the frayed marks where the lace had been stripped off, voluminous in the skirts, but very tight in the sleeves, which were so short as to leave his large, bony paws and 6 inches of his arm above the wrist exposed. Altogether, it fitted him like a purser's shirt on a handspike. "Why, for 100 thaler, I will land them safe in Mackinac Bay. But how shall we manage, Williamson? The cabin was pint yesterday." The Scotch negro nodded. "Never mind. I dare say the smell of the paint won't signify to the gentleman." The bargain was ratified. We agreed to pay the stipulated sum, and that same evening, having dropped down with the last of the sea breeze, we set sail from Boca Chica, and began working up under the lee of the headland of Punta Canoa. When off the San Domingo gate, we burned a blue light, which was immediately answered by another inshore of us. In the glare we could perceive 2 boats full of men. Anyone who has ever played at Snapdragon can imagine the unearthly appearance of objects when seen by this species of firework. In the present instance it was held aloft on a boat hook, and cast a strong spectral light on the band of lawless ruffians, who were so crowded together that they entirely filled the boats, no part of which could be seen. It seemed as if 2 clusters of fiends, suddenly vomited forth from hell, were floating on the surface of the midnight sea, in the midst of brimstone flames. In a few moments our crew was strengthened by about 40 as ugly Christians as I ever set eyes on. They were of all ages, countries, complexions, and tongues, and looked as if they had been kidnapped by a press gang as they had knocked off from the Tower of Babel. From the moment they came on board, Captain Vanderbosch was shorn of all his glory, and sank into the petty officer, while, to our amazement, the Scottish negro took the command, evincing great coolness, energy, and skill. He ordered the schooner to be wore as soon as we had shipped the men, and laid her head off the land, then set all hands to shift the old suit of sails, and to bend new ones. "Why did you not shift your canvas before we started?" said I to the Dutch captain, or mate, or whatever he might be. "Why won't you be content to take a quiet passage, and hax no question?" was the uncivil rejoinder, which I felt inclined to resent, until I remembered that we were in the hands of the Philistines, where a quarrel would have been worse than useless. I was gulping down the insult as well as I could, when the black captain came aft, and, with the air of an equal, invited us into the cabin to take a glass of grog. We had scarcely sat down before we heard a noise like the swaying up of guns, or some other heavy articles, from the hold. I caught Mr. Splinter's eye. He nodded, but said nothing. In half an hour afterwards, when we went on deck, we saw by the light of the moon 12 18-pound carronades mounted, 6 of a side, with their accompaniments of rammers and sponges, water buckets, boxes of round grape, and canister and tubs of wadding, while the coamings of the hatchways were thickly studded with round shot. The tarpaulin and lumber forward had disappeared, and there lay Long Tom, ready levelled, grinning on his pivot. The ropes were all coiled away and laid down in regular man-o'-war fashion, while an ugly gruff beast of a Spanish mulatto, apparently the officer of the watch, walked the weather side of the quarter-deck, in true pendulum style. Lookouts were placed aft and at the gangways and bows, who every now and then passed the word to keep the bright lookout, while the rest of the watch were stretched silent, but evidently broad awake, under the lee of the boat. We noticed that each man had his cutlass buckled round his waist, that the boarding pikes had been cut loose from the main boom round which they had been stopped, and that about 30 muskets were ranged along a fixed rack that ran athwartships near the main hatchway. By the time we had reconnoitred thus far, the night became overcast, and a thick bank of clouds began to rise to windward. Some heavy drops of rain fell, and the thunder grumbled at a distance. The veil crept gradually on until it shrouded the whole firmament, and left us in as dark a night as ever poor devils were out in. By and by, a narrow streak of bright moonlight appeared under the lower edge of the bank, defining the dark outlines of the tumbling, multitudinous billows on the horizon as distinctly as if they had been pasteboard waves in a theatre. "Is that a sail to windward in the clear, think you?" said Mr. Splinter to me in a whisper. At this moment it lightened vividly. "I am sure it is," continued he. "I could see her white canvas glance just now." I looked steadily, and at last caught the small dark speck against the bright background, rising and falling on the swell of the sea like a feather. As we stood on, she was seen more distinctly, but to all appearance nobody was aware of her proximity. We were mistaken in this, however, for the captain suddenly jumped on a gun and gave his orders with a fiery energy that startled us. "Hurroo!" A small French boy was at his side in a moment. "Forward, and call all hands to shorten sail. But doucement, you land crab. Man the fore clew garnets. Hands by the top-gallant clew lines. Jib down haul. Rise tacks and sheets. Peak and throat halyards. Let go. Clew up. Settle away the main gaff there." In almost as short a space as I have taken to write it, every inch of canvas was close furled. Every light except the one in the binnacle, and that was cautiously masked, carefully extinguished. 120 men at quarters, and the ship under bare poles. The head yards were then squared, and we bore up before the wind. The stratagem proved successful. The strange sail could be seen through the night glasses, cracking on close to the wind, evidently under the impression that we had tacked. "There she goes, chasing de gobel," said the Dutchman. She now burned a blue light, by which we saw she was a heavy cutter, without doubt our old fellow cruiser, the Spark. The Dutchman had come to the same conclusion. "My eye, Captain, no use to dodge from her. It is only that footy little King's cutter on the Jamaica station." "It is her, true enough," answered Williamson, "and she is from Santa Marta, with a freight of specie, I know. I will try a brush with her, by—" Splinter struck in before he could finish his irreverent exclamation. "If your conjecture be true, I know the craft, a heavy vessel of her class, and you may depend on hard knocks, and small profit if you do take her. While if she takes you, I'll be hanged if she does." And he grinned at the conceit, then setting his teeth hard, "Or rather, I will blow the schooner up with my own hand before I strike. Better than that to have one's bones bleached in chains on a quay at Port Royal. But you see you cannot control us, gentlemen, so get down into the cable tier, and take Peter Mangrove with you. I would not willingly see those come to harm who have trusted me." However, there was no shot flying as yet. We therefore stayed on deck. All sail was once more made. The carronades were cast loose on both sides, and double-shotted. The long guns slewed round, the tack of the fore and aft foresail hauled up, and we kept by the wind, and stood after the cutter, whose white canvas we could still see through the gloom like a snow wreath. As soon as she saw us, she tacked and stood toward us, and came bowling along gallantly, with the water roaring and flashing at her bows. As the vessels neared each other, they both shortened sail, and finding that we could not weather her, we steered close under her lee. As we crossed on opposite tacks, her commander hailed, "Ho, the brigantine, ahoy!" "Hello," sung out the blackie as he backed his main topsail. "What schooner is that?" "The Spanish schooner, Caridad." "Whence and whither bound?" "Cartagena to Puerto Rico." "Heave to, and send your boat on board." "We have none that will swim, sir." "Very well, bring to, and I will send mine." "Call away the boarders," said our captain in a low, stern tone. "Let them crouch out of sight behind the boat." The cutter wore and hove to under our lee quarter, within pistol shot. We heard the rattle of the ropes running through the davit blocks, and the splash of the jolly boat touching the water. Then the measured stroke of the oars as they glanced like silver in the sparkling sea, and a voice calling out, "Give way, my lads." The character of the vessel we were on board of was now evident, and the bitter reflection that we were chained to the stake on board of a pirate, on the eve of a fierce contest with one of our own cruisers, was aggravated by the consideration that the cutter had fallen into a snare by which a whole boat's crew would be sacrificed before a shot was fired. I watched my opportunity as she pulled up alongside, and called out, leaning well over the nettings, "Get back to your ship! Treachery! Get back to your ship!" The little French serpent was at my side with the speed of thought, his long clear knife glancing in one hand, while the fingers of the other were laid on his lips. He could not have said more plainly, "Hold your tongue, or I'll cut your throat." But Sneezer now startled him by rushing between us and giving a short, angry growl. The officer in the boat had heard me imperfectly. He rose up. "I won't go back, my good man, until I see what you are made of." And as he spoke he sprang on board, but the instant he got over the bulwarks, he was caught by two strong hands, gagged, and thrown bodily down the main hatchway. "Heave!" cried a voice, and with a will, and 4 cold 32-pound shot were hove at once into the boat alongside, which, crashing through her bottom, swamped her in a moment, precipitating the miserable crew into the boiling sea. Their shrieks still ring in my ears as they clung to the oars and some loose planks of the boat. "Bring up the officer, and take out the gag," said Williamson. Poor Welcome, who had been an old messmate of mine, was now dragged to the gangway half naked, his face bleeding and heavily ironed, when the blackamoor, clapping a pistol to his head, bid him, as he feared instant death, hail that the boat had swamped under the counter, and to send another. The poor fellow, who appeared stunned and confused, did so, but without seeming to know what he said. "Good God," said Mr. Splinter, "don't you mean to pick up the boat's crew?" The blood curdled to my heart as the black savage answered in a voice of thunder, "Let them drown and be damned. Fill and stand on." But the clouds by this time broke away, and the mild moon shone clear and bright once more upon this scene of most atrocious villainy. By her light the cutter's people could see that there was no one struggling in the water now, and that the people must either have been saved, or were past all earthly aid. but the infamous deception was not entirely at an end. The captain of the cutter, seeing we were making sail, did the same, and after having shot ahead of us, hailed once more, "Mr. Welcome, why don't you run to leeward and heave to, sir?" "Answer him instantly and hail again for another boat," said the sable fiend, and cocked his pistol. The click went to my heart. The young midshipman turned his pale, mild countenance, laced with his blood, upwards toward the moon and stars, as one who had looked his last upon earth. The large tears were flowing down his cheeks and mingling with the crimson streaks, and a flood of silver light fell on the fine features of the poor boy as he said firmly, "Never." The miscreant fired, and he fell dead. "Up with the helm and wear across her stern." The order was obeyed. "Fire!" The whole broadside was poured in, and we could hear the shot rattle and tear across the cutter's deck, and the shrieks and groans of the wounded, while the white splinters glanced away in all directions. We now ranged alongside, and close action commenced, and never do I expect to see such an infernal scene again. Up to this moment there had been neither confusion nor noise on board the pirate. All had been coolness and order. But when the yards locked, the crew broke loose from all control. They ceased to be men, they were demons, and they threw their own dead and wounded, as they were mown down like grass by the cutter's grape, indiscriminately down the hatchways to get clear of them. They had stripped themselves almost naked, and although they fought with the most desperate courage, yelling and cursing, each in his own tongue most hideously, yet their very numbers, pent up in a small vessel, were against them. At length, amidst the fire and smoke and hellish uproar, we could see that the deck had become a very shambles, and unless they soon carried the cutter by boarding, it was clear that the coolness and discipline of my own glorious service must prevail, even against such fearful odds, the superior size of the vessel, the number of guns, and heavier metal. The pirates seemed aware of this themselves, for they now made a desperate attempt forward to carry their antagonist by boarding, led on by the black captain. Just at this moment, the cutter's main boom fell across the schooner's deck, close to where we were sheltering ourselves from the shot the best way we could, and while the rush forward was being made, by a sudden impulse, Splinter and I, followed by Peter and the dog, who with wonderful sagacity, seeing the uselessness of resistance, had cowered quietly by my side during the whole row, scrambled along it as the cutter's people were repelling the attack on her bow, and all four of us, in our haste, jumped down on the poor Irishman at the wheel. "Murder, fire, rape, and robbery! It is capsized, stove in, sunk, burned, and destroyed I am! Captain, captain, we are carried aft here. Oh, hubbub for Patrick Donnelly!" There was no time to be lost. If any of the crew came aft, we were dead men, so we tumbled down through the cabin skylight, men and beast, the hatch having been knocked off by a shot, and stowed ourselves away in the side berths. The noise on deck soon ceased. The cannon were again plied. Gradually the fire slackened, and we could hear that the pirate had scraped clear and escaped. Some time after this, the lieutenant commanding the cutter came down. Poor Mr. Douglas! Both Mr. Splinter and I knew him well. He sat down and covered his face with his hands, while the blood oozed down between his fingers. He had received a cutlass wound on the head in the attack. His right arm was bound up with his neckcloth, and he was very pale. "Steward, bring me a light. Ask the doctor how many are killed and wounded, and, do you hear? Tell him to come to me when he is done forward, but not a moment sooner. To have been so mauled and duped by a buccaneer, and my poor boat's crew." Splinter groaned. He started, but at this moment the man returned again. 13 killed, your honour, and 15 wounded. Scarcely one of us untouched. The poor fellow's own skull was bound round with a bloody cloth. God help me, God help me, but they have died the death of men. Who knows what death the poor fellows in the boat have died? Here he was cut short by a tremendous scuffle on the ladder, down which an old quartermaster was trundled, neck and crop, into the cabin. "How now, Jones?" "Please, your honour," said the man, as soon as he had gathered himself up, and had time to turn his quid and smooth down his hair. But again the uproar was renewed, and Donnelly was lugged in, scrambling and struggling between two seamen. "This here Irish chap, your honour, has lost his wits, if so be he ever had any, your honour. He has gone mad through fright." "Fright be damned!" roared Donnelly. "No man ever frightened me, but as his honour was skewering them bloody thieves forward, I was boarded and carried after by the devil, your honour. Pooped by Beelzebub, by gad!" And he rapped his fist on the table until everything on it danced again. "There were 4 of 'em, your honour, a black one and 2 blue ones, and a piebald one with 4 legs and a bushy tail, each with 2 horns on his head, for all the world like those on Father McCleary's red cow. No, she was humble. His Father Clanahan's, I mean. No, not his neither, for his was the parish bull. Faith, I don't know what I mean, except that they all had horns on their heads and vomited fire, and each one of them had a tail at his stern, twisting and twining like a conger eel, with a blue light on the end of it." "And that's a lie, if ever there was one," exclaimed Peter Mangrove, jumping from the berth. "Look at me, you Irish thief, and tell me if I have a blue light or a conger eel in my stern." This was too much for poor Donnelly. He yelled out, "You'll believe your own eyes now, your honour, when you seen one of them bodily before you. Let me go, let me go!" And rushing up the ladder, he would, in all probability, have ended his earthly career in the salt sea, had his bullet head not encountered the broadest part of the purser, who was in the act of descending, with such violence that he shot him out of the companion several feet above the deck, as if he had been discharged from a culverin, but the recoil sent poor Donnelly, stunned and senseless, to the bottom of the ladder. There was no standing all this. We laughed outright, and made ourselves known to Mr. Douglas, who received us cordially, and in a week we were landed at Port Royal. End of Section 1. Recording by Tysto, tysto.com.
Section 2 of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 2. The Capture of Panama. The Capture of Panama, 1671 and 2. John Esquemeling. Captain Morgan set forth from the castle of Chagre towards Panama, August 18, 1870. He had with him 1,200 men, 5 boats laden with auxiliary, and 32 canoes. The first day they sailed only 6 leagues, and came to a place called De los Bracos. Here a party of his men went ashore, only to sleep and stretch their limbs, being almost crippled with lying too much crowded in the boats. Having rested a while, they went abroad to seek victuals in the neighboring plantations, but they could find none, the Spaniards being fled, and carrying with them all they had. This day, being the first of their journey, they had such scarcity of victuals, as the greatest part were forced to pass with only a pipe of tobacco, without any other refreshment. Next day, about evening, they came to a place called Cruz de Juan Gallego. Here they were compelled to leave their boats and canoes, the river being very dry for want of rain, and many trees having fallen into it. The guides told them that, about 2 leagues farther, the country would be very good to continue the journey by land. Hereupon they left 160 men on board the boats to defend them, that they might serve for a refuge in necessity. Next morning, being the third day, they all went ashore, except those who were able to keep the boats. To these Captain Morgan gave order, under great penalties, that no man, on any pretext whatever, should dare to leave the boats and go ashore, fearing lest they should be surprised by an ambuscade of Spaniards in the neighboring woods, which appeared so thick as to seem almost impenetrable. This morning, beginning their march, the ways proved so bad that Captain Morgan thought it more convenient to transport some of the men in canoes, though with great labor, to a place farther up the river called Cedro Bueno. Thus they re-embarked, and the canoes returned for the rest, so that about night they got all together at the said place. The pirates much desired to meet some Spaniards or Indians, hoping to fill their bellies with their provisions, being reduced to extremity and hunger. The fourth day the greatest part of the pirates marched by land, being led by one of the guides. The rest went by water farther up, being conducted by another guide, who always went before them, to discover, on both sides of the river, the ambuscades. These had also spies, who were very dexterous to give notice of all accidents, or of the arrival of the pirates, 6 hours at least before they came. This day, about noon, they came near a post called Tornacavallos. Here the guide of the canoes cried out that he perceived an ambuscade. His voice caused infinite joy to all the pirates, hoping to find some provisions to satiate their extreme hunger. Being come to the place, they found nobody in it, the Spaniards being fled, and leaving nothing behind but a few leathern bags, all empty, and a few crumbs of bread scattered on the ground where they had eaten. Being angry at this, they pulled down a few little huts which the Spaniards had made, and fell to eating the leathern bags, to allay the ferment of their stomachs, which was now so sharp as to gnaw their very bowels. Thus they made a huge banquet upon these bags of leather, divers quarrels arising concerning the greatest shares. By the bigness of the place, they conjectured about 500 Spaniards had been there, whom, finding no victuals, they were now infinitely desirous to meet, intending to devour some of them rather than perish. Having feasted themselves on these pieces of leather, they marched on, till they came about night to another post, called Torna Muni. Here they found another ambuscade, but as barren as the former. They searched the neighboring woods, but could not find anything to eat, the Spaniards having been so provident as not to leave anywhere the least crumb of subsistence, whereby the pirates were now brought to this extremity. Here again he was happy that he had reserved since noon any bit of leather to make his supper of, drinking after it a good draught of water for his comfort. Some, who were never out of their mothers' kitchens, may ask how these pirates could eat and digest those pieces of leather, so hard and dry. Whom I answer that, could they once experiment what hunger, or rather famine, is, they would find the way as the pirates did. For these first sliced it in pieces, then they beat it between two stones and rubbed it, often dipping it in water to make it supple and tender. Lastly, they scraped off the hair and broiled it. Thus being cooked, they cut it into small morsels and ate it, helping it down with frequent gulps of water, which by good fortune they had at hand. The fifth day, about noon, they came to a place called Barbarossa. Here they found traces of another ambuscade, but the place totally as unprovided as the former. At a small distance were several plantations, which they searched very narrowly, but could not find any person, animal, or other thing to relieve their extreme hunger. Finally, having ranged about and searched a long time, they found a grot, which seemed to be but lately hewn out of a rock, where were 2 sacks of meal, wheat, and like things, with 2 great jars of wine, and certain fruits called plantanoes. Captain Morgan, knowing some of his men were now almost dead with hunger, and fearing the same of the rest, caused what was found to be distributed among them who were in greatest necessity. Having refreshed themselves with these victuals, they marched anew with greater courage than ever. Such as were weak were put into the canoes, and those commanded to land that were in them before. Thus they prosecuted their journey till late at night, when, coming to a plantation, they took up their rest, but without eating anything, for the Spaniards as before had swept away all manner of provisions. The 6th day they continued their march, part by land and part by water. Howbeit, they were constrained to rest very frequently, for both the ruggedness of the way and their extreme weakness, which they endeavored to relieve by eating leaves of trees and green herbs or grass. Such was their miserable condition. This day at noon they arrived at a plantation, where was a barn full of maize. Immediately they beat down the doors and ate it dry, as much as they could devour. Then they distributed a great quantity, giving every man a good allowance. Thus provided, and prosecuting their journey for about an hour, they came to another ambuscade. This they no sooner discovered, but they threw away their maize, with the sudden hopes of finding all things in abundance. But they were much deceived, meeting neither Indians nor victuals, nor anything else. But they saw, on the other side of the river, about 100 Indians, who, all fleeing, escaped. Some pirates leaped into the river to cross it, and to try to take any of the Indians, but in vain, for being much more nimble than the pirates, they not only baffled them, but killed 2 or 3 with their arrows, hooting at them and crying, "Ha, perros! A la sabana! A la sabana! Hey, ye dogs, go to the plain! Go to the plain!" This day they could advance no farther, being necessitated to pass the river, to continue their march on the other side. Hereupon they reposed for that night, though their sleep was not profound, for great murmurings were made at Captain Morgan and his conduct, some being desirous to return home, while others would rather die than go back a step from their undertaking. Others who had great courage laughed and joked at their discourse. Meanwhile they had a guide who much comforted them, saying, it would not now be long before they met with people, for whom they should reap some considerable advantage. The 7th day, in the morning, they made clean their arms, and every one discharged his pistol or musket, without bullet, to try their firelocks. This done, they crossed the river, leaving the post where they rested, called Santa Cruz, and at noon they arrived at a village called Cruz. Being yet far from the place, they perceived much smoke from the chimneys. The sight hereof gave them great joy, and hopes of finding people and plenty of good cheer. Thus they went on as fast as they could, encouraging one another, saying, "There is smoke comes out of every house. They are making good fires to roast and boil what we are to eat," and the like. At length they arrived there, all sweating and panting, but found no person in the town, nor anything eatable to refresh themselves, except good fires, which they wanted not, for the Spaniards before their departure had every one set fire to his own house, except the king's storehouses and stables. They had not left behind them any beast, alive or dead, which much troubled their pursuers, not finding anything but a few cats and dogs, which they immediately killed and devoured. At last, in the king's stables, they found, by good fortune, 15 or 16 jars of Peru wine, and a leathern sack full of bread. No sooner had they drunk of this wine, when they fell sick, almost every man. This made them think the wine was poisoned, which caused a new consternation in the whole camp, judging themselves now to be irrecoverably lost. But the true reason was their want of subsistence, and the manifold sorts of trash they had eaten. Their sickness was so great as caused them to remain there till the next morning, without being able to prosecute their journey in the afternoon. This village is seated in 9 degrees 2 minutes north latitude, distance from the river Chagre, 26 Spanish leagues, and 8 from Panama. This is the last place to which boats or canoes can come, for which reason they built here storehouses for all sorts of merchandise, which to and from Panama are transported on the backs of mules. Here Captain Morgan was forced to leave his canoes and land all his men, though never so weak, but lest the canoes should be surprised or take up too many men for their defense, he sent them all back to the place where the boats were, except one, which he hid, that it might serve to carry intelligence. Many of the Spaniards and Indians of this village having fled to the near plantations, Captain Morgan ordered that none should go out of the village, except companies of 100 together, fearing lest the enemy should take an advantage upon his men. Notwithstanding, one party contravened these orders, being tempted with the desire of victuals, but they were soon glad to fly into the town again, being assaulted with great fury by some Spaniards and Indians, who carried one of them away prisoner. Thus the vigilancy and care of Captain Morgan was not sufficient to prevent every accident. The 8th day, in the morning, Captain Morgan sent 200 men before the body of his army to discover the way to Panama, and any ambuscades therein, the path being so narrow that only 10 or 12 persons could march abreast, and often not so many. After 10 hours' march they came to a place called Quebrada Obscura. Here, all of a sudden, 3,000 or 4,000 arrows were shot at them, they not perceiving whence they came, or who shot them, though they presumed it was from a high rocky mountain, from one side to the other, whereupon was a grot, capable of but one horse or other beast laded. This multitude of arrows much alarmed the pirates, especially because they could not discover whence they were discharged. At last, seeing no more arrows, they marched a little farther, and entered a wood. Here they perceived some Indians to fly as fast as they could, to take advantage of another post, thence to observe their march. Yet there remained one troop of Indians on the place, resolved to fight and defend themselves, which they did with great courage, till their captain fell down wounded, who, though he despaired of life, yet his valor being greater than his strength, would ask no quarter, but endeavoring to raise himself with undaunted mind, laid hold of his azagayo, or javelin, and struck it at one of the pirates, but before he could second the blow, he was shot to death. This was also the fate of many of his companions, who, like good soldiers, lost their lives with their captain for the defense of their country. The pirates endeavored to take some of the Indians prisoners, but they being swifter than the pirates, every one escaped, leaving 8 pirates dead and 10 wounded. Yea, had the Indians been more dexterous in military affairs, they might have defended the passage, and not let one man pass. A little while after they came to a large campaign, open and full of fine meadows. Hence they could perceive at a distance before them some Indians, on the top of a mountain, near the way by which they were to pass. They sent 50 men, the nimblest they had, to try to catch any of them, and force them to discover their companions, but all in vain, for they escaped by their nimbleness, and presently showed themselves in another place, hollowing to the English, and crying, a la savana, perros ingleses, that is, to the plain, ye English dogs. Meanwhile, the 10 pirates that were wounded were dressed and plastered up. Here was a wood, and on each side a mountain. The Indians possessed themselves of one, and the pirates of the other. Captain Morgan was persuaded the Spaniards had placed an ambuscade there, it lying so conveniently. Hereupon he sent 200 men to search it. The Spaniards and Indians, perceiving the pirates descended the mountain, did so too, as if they designed to attack them, but being got into the wood, out of sight of the pirates, they were seen no more, leaving the passage open. About night fell a great rain, which caused the pirates to march the faster, and seek for houses to preserve their arms from being wet. But the Indians had set fire to every one, and driven away all their cattle, that the pirates, finding neither houses nor victuals, might be constrained to return. But after diligent search, they found a few shepherds' huts, but in them nothing to eat. These not holding many men, they placed in them out of every company a small number, who kept the arms of the rest. Those who remained in the open field endured much hardship that night, the rain not ceasing till morning. Next morning, about the break of day, being the 9th of that tedious journey, Captain Morgan marched on while the fresh air of the morning lasted, for the clouds hanging yet over their heads were much more favorable than the scorching rays of the sun, the way being now more difficult than before. After 2 hours' march they discovered about 20 Spaniards, who observed their motions, They endeavored to catch some of them, but could not, they suddenly disappearing and absconding themselves in caves among the rocks unknown to the pirates. At last, ascending a high mountain, they discovered the South Sea. This happy sight, as it were the end of their labors, caused infinite joy among them. Hence they could descry also one ship and 6 boats, which were set forth from Panama, and sailed towards the isles of Tavaga and Tavogia. Then they came to a vale, where they found much cattle, whereof they killed good store. Here, while some killed and flayed cows, horses, bulls, and chiefly asses, of whom there were most, others kindled fires, and got wood to roast them. Then, cutting the flesh into convenient pieces, or gobbets, they threw them into the fire, and half carbonated, or roasted, they devoured them with incredible haste and appetite. Such was their hunger, that they more resembled cannibals than Europeans, the blood many times running down their beards to their waists. Having satisfied their hunger, Captain Morgan then continued the march. Here again he sent before the main body 50 men to take some prisoners, if they could, for he was much more concerned that in 9 days he could not meet one person to inform him of the condition and forces of the Spaniards. About evening they discovered about 200 Spaniards, who hallooed to the pirates, but they understood not what they said. A little while after they came in sight of the highest steeple of Panama. This they no sooner discovered, but they showed signs of extreme joy, casting up their hats into the air, leaping and shouting, just as if they had already obtained the victory and accomplished their designs. All their trumpets sounded and drums beat, in token of this alacrity of their minds. Thus they pitched their camp for that night, with general content of the whole army, waiting with impatience for the morning, when they intended to attack the city. This evening appeared 50 horses, who came out of the city, on the noise of the drums and trumpets, to observe, as it was thought, their motions. They came almost within musket shot of the army, with a trumpet that sounded marvelously well. Those on horseback hallooed aloud to the pirates, and threatened them, saying, "Perros, nos veremos," that is, "Ye dogs, we shall meet ye." Having made this menace, they returned to the city, except only 7 or 8 horsemen, who hovered thereabouts to watch their motions. Immediately after the city fired, and ceased not to play their biggest guns all night loud against the camp, but with little or no harm to the pirates, whom they could not easily reach. Now also the 200 Spaniards, whom the pirates had seen in the afternoon, appeared again, making a show of blocking up the passages, that no pirates might escape their hands. But the pirates, though in a manner besieged, instead of fearing their blockades, as soon as they had placed sentinels about their camp, opened their satchels, and without any napkins or plates, fell to eating, very heartily, the pieces of bulls and horses' flesh, which they had reserved since noon. This done, they laid themselves down to sleep on the grass, with great repose and satisfaction, expecting only with impatience the dawning of the next day. The 10th day, betimes in the morning, they put all their men in order, and with drums and trumpets sounding, marched directly towards the city. But one of the guides desired Captain Morgan not to take the common highway, lest they should find in it many ambuscades. He took his advice, and chose another way through the wood, though very irksome and difficult. The Spaniards, perceiving the pirates had taken another way they scarce had thought on, were compelled to leave their stops and batteries, and to come out to meet them. The governor of Panama put his forces in order, consisting of 2 squadrons, 4 regiments of foot, and a huge number of wild bulls, which were driven by a great number of Indians, with some Negroes, and others to help them. The pirates, now upon their march, came to the top of a little hill, whence they had a large prospect of the city and campaign country underneath. Here they discovered the forces of the people of Panama, in battle array, to be so numerous that they were surprised with fear, much doubting the fortune of the day. Yea, few or none there were but wished themselves at home, or at least free from obligation of that engagement, it so nearly concerning their lives. Having been some time wavering in their minds, they at last reflected on the straits they had brought themselves into, and that now they must either fight resolutely or die, for no quarter could be expected from an enemy on whom they had committed so many cruelties. Hereupon they encouraged one another, resolving to conquer, or to spend the last drop of blood. Then they divided themselves into 3 battalions, sending before 200 buccaneers, who were very dexterous at their guns. Then, descending the hill, they marched directly towards the Spaniards, who, in a spacious field, waited their coming. As soon as they drew nigh, the Spaniards began to shout and cry, "Viva el Rey!" God save the king, and immediately their horse moved against the pirates, but the fields being full of quags and soft underfoot, they could not wheel about as they desired. The 200 buccaneers who went before, each putting one knee to the ground, began to battle briskly, with a full volley of shot. The Spaniards defended themselves courageously, doing all they could to disorder the pirates. Their foot endeavored to second the horse, but were forced by the fire of the pirates to retreat. Finding themselves baffled, they attempted to drive the bulls against them behind, to put them into disorder, but the wild cattle ran away, frightened with the noise of the battle. Only some few broke through the English companies, and only tore the colors in pieces, while the buccaneers shot nearly every one of them dead. The battle having continued 2 hours, the greatest part of the Spanish horse was ruined, while the buccaneers shot every one of them dead. The battle having continued 2 hours, the greatest part of the Spanish horse was ruined, and almost all killed, the rest fled, which the foot seeing, and that they could not possibly prevail, they discharged the shot they had in their muskets, and throwing them down, fled away, every one as he could. The pirates could not follow them, being too much harassed and wearied with their long journey. Many, not being able to fly whither they desired, hid themselves, for that present, among the shrubs of the seaside, but very unfortunately, for most of them being found by the pirates, were instantly killed, without any quarter. Some religious men were brought prisoners before Captain Morgan, but he, being deaf to their cries, commanded them all to be pistoled, which was done. Soon after they brought a captain to him, whom he examined very strictly, particularly wherein consisted the forces of those of Panama. He answered, their whole strength consisted in 400 horse, 24 companies of foot, each 100 men complete, 60 Indians and some Negroes, who were to drive 2,000 wild bulls upon the English, and thus by breaking their files put them into total disorder. Besides that in the city they had made some trenches, and raised batteries in several places, in all which they had placed many guns, and at that entry of the highway leading to the city they had built a fort, mounted with 8 great brass guns, defended by 50 men. Captain Morgan, having heard this, gave orders instantly to march another way, but first he made a review of his men, whereof he found both killed and wounded a considerable number, and much greater than had been believed. Of the Spaniards were found 600 dead on the place, besides the wounded and prisoners. The pirates, nothing discouraged, seeing their numbers so diminished, but rather filled with greater pride, perceiving what huge advantage they had obtained against their enemies, having rested some time, prepared to march courageously towards the city, plighting their oaths to one another that they would fight till not a man was left alive. With this courage they recommended their march, either to conquer or to be conquered, carrying with them all the prisoners. They found much difficulty in their approach to the city, for within the town the Spaniards had placed many great guns, at several quarters, some charged with small pieces of iron, others with musket bullets. With these they saluted the pirates at their approaching, and gave them full and frequent broadsides, firing at them incessantly, so that unavoidably they lost at every step great numbers of men. But not these manifest dangers of their lives, nor the sight of so many as dropped continually at their sides, could deter them from advancing, and gaining ground every moment on the enemy, and though the Spaniards never ceased to fire, and act the best they could for their defense, yet they were forced to yield, after 3 hours' combat. And the pirates, having possessed themselves at last of the city, killed all that attempted in the least to oppose them. The inhabitants had transported the best of their goods to more remote and secret places. Howbeit, they found in the city several warehouses well stocked with merchandise, as well silks and cloths, as linen and other things of value. As soon as the first fury of their entrance was over, Captain Morgan assembled his men, and commanded them, under great penalties, not to drink or taste any wine, and the reason he gave for it was this: because he had intelligence that it was all poisoned by the Spaniards. Howbeit, it was thought he gave these prudent orders to prevent the debauchery of his people, which he foresaw would be very great at the first, after so much hunger sustained by the way, fearing withal lest the Spaniards, seeing them in wine, should rally, and, falling on the city, use them as humanely as they had used the inhabitants before. Captain Morgan, as soon as he had placed necessary guards at several quarters within and without the city, commanded 25 men to seize a great boat, which had struck in the mud of the port for want of water at a low tide. The same day, about noon, he caused fire privately to be set to several great edifices of the city, nobody knowing who were the authors thereof, much less of what motives Captain Morgan did it, which are unknown to this day. The fire increased so that before the night the greatest part of the city was in a flame. Captain Morgan pretended the Spaniards had done it, perceiving that his own people reflected on him for that action. Many of the Spaniards, and some of the pirates, did what they could, either to quench the flames, or by blowing up houses with gunpowder, and pulling down others to stop it, but in vain, for in less than half an hour it consumed a whole street. All the houses of the city were built with cedar, very curious and magnificent, and richly adorned, especially with hangings and paintings, whereof part were before removed, but another great part were consumed by fire. There were in this city, which is the see of a bishop, 8 monasteries, 7 for men and 1 for women, 2 stately churches, and 1 hospital. The churches and monasteries were all richly adorned with altarpieces and paintings, much gold and silver, and other precious things, all which the ecclesiastics had hidden, besides which here were 2,000 houses of magnificent building, the greatest part inhabited by merchants, vastly rich. For the rest of less quality and tradesmen, this city contained 5,000 more. Here were also many stables for the horses and mules that carry the plate of the King of Spain, as well as of private men, towards the North Sea. The neighboring fields were full of fertile plantations and pleasant gardens, affording delicious prospects to the inhabitants all of the year. The Genoese had in this city a stately house for their trade of negroes. This likewise was by Captain Morgan burnt to the very ground, besides which building there were consumed 200 warehouses and many slaves, who had hid themselves therein with innumerable sacks of meal, the fire of which continued 4 weeks after it had begun. The greatest part of the pirates still encamped without the city, fearing and expecting the Spaniards could come and fight them anew, it being known they much outnumbered the pirates. This made them keep the field, to preserve their forces united, now much diminished by their losses. Their wounded, which were many, they put into one church, which remained standing, the rest being consumed by the fire. Besides these decrees of his men, Captain Morgan had sent a convoy of 150 men to the castle of Chagre, to carry the news of his victory at Panama. They saw often whole troops of Spaniards run to and fro in the fields, which made them suspect their rallying, which they never had the courage to do. In the afternoon Captain Morgan re-entered the city with his troops, that every one might take up their lodgings, which now they could hardly find, few houses being escaped the fire. Then they sought very carefully among the ruins and ashes for utensils of plate or gold, that were not quite wasted by the flames, and of such they found no small number, especially in wells and cisterns where the Spaniards had hid them. Next day Captain Morgan dispatched away 2 troops of 150 men each, stout and well armed, to seek for the inhabitants who were escaped. These, having made several excursions up and down the fields, woods, and mountains adjacent, returned after 2 days, and bringing above 200 prisoners, men, women, and slaves. The next day returned also the boat which Captain Morgan had sent to the South Sea, bringing 3 other boats which they had taken. But all these pirates they could willingly have given, and greater labor into the bargain, for 1 galleon, which miraculously escaped, richly laden with the king's plate, jewels, and other precious goods of the best and richest merchants of Panama, on board which were also the religious women of the nunnery, who had embarked with them all the ornaments of their church, consisting of much gold, plate, and other things of value. The strength of this galleon was inconsiderable, having only 7 guns and 10 or 12 muskets, and very ill provided with victuals, necessities, and fresh water, having no more sails than the uppermost of the mast. This account the pirates received from someone who had spoken with 7 mariners belonging to the galleon, who came ashore in the cockboat for fresh water. Hence they concluded they might easily have taken it, had they given her chase, as they should have done, but they were impeded from following this vastly rich prize by their gluttony and drunkenness, having plentifully debauched themselves with several rich wines they had found ready, choosing rather to satiate their appetites than to lay hold on such huge advantage, since this one prize would have been of far greater value than all they got at Panama and the places thereabout. Next day, repenting of their negligence, being weary of their vices and debaucheries, they set forth another boat, well armed, to pursue with all speed the said galleon, but in vain, the Spaniards who were on board having had intelligence of their own danger 1 or 2 days before, while the pirates were cruising so near them, whereupon they fled to places more remote and unknown. The pirates found, in the ports of the islands of Tavoga and Togavilla, several boats laden with very good merchandise, all of which they took and brought to Panama, where they made an exact relation of all they had passed to Captain Morgan. The prisoners confirmed what the pirates said, adding that they undoubtedly knew where the galleon might then be, but that it was very probable that they had been relieved before now from other places. This stirred up Captain Morgan anew to send forth all the boats in the port of Panama to seek the said galleon till they could find her. These boats, being in all 4, after 8 days cruising to and fro, and searching several ports and creeks, lost all hope of finding her, whereupon they returned to Tavoga and Togavilla. Here they found a reasonable good ship, newly come from Paita, laden with cloth, soap, sugar, and biscuit, with 20,000 pieces of each. This they instantly seized, without the least resistance, as also a boat which was not far off, on which they laid great part of the merchandise from the ship, with some slaves. With this spoil they returned to Panama, somewhat better satisfied, yet withal much discontented that they could not meet with the galleon. The convoy which Captain Morgan had sent to the castle of Chagre returned much about the same time, bringing with them very good news, for while Captain Morgan was on his journey to Panama, those he had left in the castle of Chagre had sent for 2 boats to cruise. These met with a Spanish ship, which they chased within sight of the castle. This being perceived by the pirates in the castle, they put forth Spanish colors to deceive the ship that fled before the boats, and the poor Spaniards, thinking to take refuge under the castle, were caught in a snare and made prisoner. The cargo on board the said vessel consisted in victuals and provisions, than which nothing could be more opportune for the castle, where they had already begun to want things of this kind. This good luck of those of Chagre caused Captain Morgan to stay longer at Panama, ordering several new excursions into the country round about, and while the pirates at Panama were upon these expeditions, those at Chagre were busy in piracies on the North Sea. Captain Morgan sent forth daily parties of 200 men to make inroads into all the country round about, and when one party came back, another went forth, who soon gathered much riches and many prisoners. These, being brought into the city, were put into the most exquisite tortures, to make them confess both other people's goods and their own. Here it happened that one poor wretch was found in the house of a person of quality, who had put on, amidst the confusion, a pair of taffety breeches of his master's, with a little silver key hanging out, receiving which, they asked him for the cabinet of the said key. His answer was he knew not what was become of it, but that finding those breeches in his master's house, he had made bold to wear them. Not being able to get any other answer, they put him on the rack, and inhumanly disjointed his arms. Then they twisted a cord about his forehead, which they wrung so hard that his eyes appeared as big as eggs, and were ready to fall out. But with these torments not obtaining any positive answer, they hung him up by the wrists, giving him many blows and stripes under that intolerable pain and posture of body. Afterwards they cut off his nose and ears, and singed his face with burning straw, till he could not speak, nor lament his misery any longer. Then, losing all hopes of any confession, they bade a negro to run him through, which put an end to his life, and to their inhuman tortures. Thus did many others of those miserable prisoners finish their days, the common sport and recreation of these pirates being such tragedies. Captain Morgan, having now been at Panama full 3 weeks, commanded all things to be prepared for his departure. He ordered every company of men to seek so many beasts of carriage as might convey the spoil to the river where his canoes lay. About this time there was a great rumor that a considerable number of pirates intended to leave Captain Morgan, and that, taking a ship then in port, they determined to go and rob on the South Sea, till they had as much as they thought fit, and then return homewards by way of the East Indies, for which purpose they had gathered much provisions, which they had hid in private places, with sufficient powder, bullets, and all other ammunition. Likewise some great guns belonging to the town, muskets, and other things, wherewith they designed not only to equip their vessel, but to fortify themselves in some island, which might serve them for a place of refuge. This design had certainly taken effect, had not Captain Morgan had timely advice of it from one of their comrades. Hereupon he commanded the mainmast of the said ship to be cut down and burnt, with all the other boats in the port. Hereby the intentions of all or most of his companions were totally frustrated. Then Captain Morgan sent many of the Spaniards into the adjoining fields and country to seek for money, to ransom not only themselves but the rest of the prisoners, as likewise the ecclesiastics. Moreover, he commanded all the artillery of the town to be nailed and stopped up. At the same time he sent out a strong company of men to seek for the governor of Panama, of whom intelligence was brought that he had laid several ambuscades in the way by which he ought to return. But they returned soon after, saying that they had not found any sign of such ambuscades. For confirmation whereof they brought some prisoners, who declared that the said governor had had an intention of making some opposition by the way, but that the men designed to effect it were unwilling to undertake it, so that for want of means he could not put his designs in execution. February 24th, 1671, Captain Morgan departed from Panama, or rather from the place where the city of Panama stood, of the spoils whereof he carried with him 175 beasts of carriage, laden with silver, gold, and other precious things, besides about 600 prisoners, men, women, children, and slaves. That day they came to a river that passes through a delicious plain, a league from Panama. Here Captain Morgan put all his forces into good order, so that the prisoners were in the middle, surrounded on all sides with pirates, where nothing else was to be heard but lamentations, cries, shrieks, and doleful sighs of so many women and children, who feared Captain Morgan designed to transport them all into his own country for slaves. Besides, all those miserable prisoners endured extreme hunger and thirst at that time, which misery Captain Morgan designedly caused them to sustain, to excite them to seek for money to ransom themselves, according to the tax he had set upon every one. Many of the women begged Captain Morgan on their knees, with infinite sighs and tears, to let them return to Panama, there to live with their dead husbands and children in little huts of straw, which they would erect, seeing that they had no houses till the rebuilding of the city. But his answer was, "He came not thither to hear lamentations and cries, but to seek money." Therefore they ought first to seek out that, wherever it was to be had, and to bring it to him. Otherwise he would assuredly transport them all to such places whither they cared not to go. Next day, when the march began, those lamentable cries and shrieks were renewed, so as it would have caused compassion in the hardest heart. But Captain Morgan, as a man little given to mercy, was not moved in the least. They marched in the same order as before, one party of the pirates in the van, the prisoners in the middle, and the rest of the pirates in the rear, by which the miserable Spaniards were at every step punched and thrust in their backs and sides with the blunt ends of their arms to make them march faster. A beautiful lady, wife to one of the richest merchants of Tavoga, was led prisoner by herself between two pirates. Her lamentations pierced the skies, seeing herself carried away into captivity, often crying to the pirates and telling them that she had given orders to two religious persons, in whom she had relied, to go to a certain place, and fetch so much money as her ransom did amount to, that they had promised faithfully to do it, but having obtained the money, instead of bringing it to her, they had employed it in another way, to ransom some of their own and particular friends. This ill action of theirs was discovered by a slave, who brought a letter to the said lady. Her complaints, and the cause thereof, having brought it to Captain Morgan, he thought fit to inquire thereinto. Having found it to be true, especially hearing it confirmed by the confession of the said religious men, though under some frivolous excuses of having diverted the money but for a day or two, in which time they expected more sums to repay it, he gave liberty to the said lady, whom otherwise he designed to transport to Jamaica. But he detained the said religious men as prisoners in her place, using them according to their deserts. Captain Morgan, arriving at the town called Cruz, on the banks of the river Chagre, he published an order among the prisoners, that within 3 days every one of them should bring in their ransom, under the penalty of being transported to Jamaica. Meanwhile he gave orders for so much rice and maize to be collected thereabouts, as was necessary for victualling his ships. Here some of the prisoners were ransomed, but many others could not bring in their money. Hereupon he continued his voyage, leaving the village on the 5th of March following, carrying with him all the spoils he could. Hence he likewise led away some new prisoners, inhabitants there, with those in Panama, who had not paid their ransoms. But the 2 religious men, who had diverted the lady's money, were ransomed 3 days after by other persons, who had more compassion for them than they had shown for her. About the middle of the way to Chagre, Captain Morgan commanded them to be mustered, and caused every one to be sworn that they had concealed nothing, even not to the value of 6 pence. This done, Captain Morgan, knowing those lewd fellows would not stick to swear falsely for interest, he commanded every one to be searched very strictly, both in their clothes and satchels and elsewhere. Yea, that this order might not be ill taken by his companions, he permitted himself to be searched, even to his very shoes. To this effect, by common consent, one was assigned out of every company to be the searchers of the rest. The French pirates that assisted on this expedition disliked this new practice of searching, but being outnumbered by the English, they were forced to submit as well as the rest. The search being over, they re-embarked, and arrived at the castle of Chagre on the 9th of March. End of section 2.